What you see is a scientific article from the Chemical Warfare Bulletin newsletter, March 1944 edition, where we can see a very graphic photo. The article is titled "Instant Death by Flamethrower" and describes the flamethrower as the mercy killer. In that article, Colonel Orby Bostick explains how the flamethrower, contrary to popular belief, was a weapon as honorable as any other, and that in fact, it was not as terrifying as people thought. This contrasts with any preconceptions we might have about the flamethrower even today. The article was published in March 1944 and its message was more than clear. The flamethrower did not cause suffering to its victims, and the deaths it caused were instantaneous. This nickname became popular during World War II because of articles like this one, calling it the weapon of mercy. But how true are Colonel Bostick's words and the claims in similar studies? Is the flamethrower really a cruel weapon as it is believed today? Look, by mid-1944, gigantic battles were brewing in the Pacific. And in those battles, Japan was defending itself with very complex defensive structures, some of them impregnable to conventional weapons. The flamethrower was key to dismantling Japanese defenses and was an everyday tool for soldiers in the Pacific. However, there was another battle being fought far from the Pacific, particularly in the heart of the United States. And it was a moral battle. The creation of napalm had turned flamethrowers into weapons with extreme range, and the flames they projected could burn for much longer than before. They could stick to surfaces like wood, concrete, and of course clothing. The resulting images from the battles were, to say the least, terrifying. People were horrified to see how M4 Sherman tanks threw huge columns of fire at the Japanese, like a firefighter's hose spraying water at a fire. That made people both inside and outside the army worry about the barbarity of such a weapon. But all of this was a dilemma. The flamethrower was the only viable way to clear out Japanese bunkers. Therefore, they couldn't stop using them, but both the army and the press questioned the morality of using such a weapon. The discussion had such an impact that General Marshall himself mentioned something about it in one of his speeches. The vehement protests I am receiving against our use of the flamethrower do not indicate an understanding of the significance of our fallen at Tarawa Beach. In this context, Colonel Orby Bostick wrote this article. Bostick worked in the Chemical Corps of the United States Army and served as a chemical officer in the South Pacific. He not only had access to the flamethrower, but also observed both its operation and the results of its use. Personally, he had observed that most of the assumptions made by the detractors of the flamethrower were, at least in his opinion, somewhat biased and sensationalist. Bostick decided to thoroughly analyze whether the flamethrower really caused its victims to suffer. To do this, he first began interviewing flamethrower operators. In his study, he published the following testimony from some Marines. Less than 2 minutes after the flamethrower bursts entered the embrasures, we were examining the inside. We found 5 Japanese bodies in the bunker. None showed a sign of life. Those Japanese were definitely knocked out instantly. Later, in his study, he described witnessing it firsthand. He observed that some Japanese were found lifeless inside the bunkers, but they showed no signs of burns. He concluded that flamethrowers killed their victims instantly, without further suffering, claiming that the flamethrower was a more merciful weapon than explosives. This study was added to many others within the same army bulletin. A popular belief that persists today is that when a soldier is hit by flames, he screams in agony until he dies. Well, one particular study, based on the testimony of Captain J.F. Holtz, based on his experience in the New Georgia campaign of 1943, stated the following: can the enemy give a brief scream or not when he encounters the direct flame? All those who have operated the flamethrower or have been in action and have examined the results believe that if such a scream occurred, the enemy was already dead by the time he finished screaming. Holt also observed the same thing as Bostick. There were casualties with burns and others untouched. So the fire, which was supposed to cause the agony, was not what caused the death. Everything was clear. The flamethrower was just as cruel as a standard rifle. However, there was still no proof, no definitive evidence. The studies published in the Chemical Warfare Bulletin about the flamethrower and its apparent instant way of eliminating the enemy were basically based only on field experiences, conjectures, and theories rather than on concrete scientific research. At first they weren't taken seriously, but Bostick's study got so much media attention that the United States Army Chemical Warfare Service began to fund studies on flamethrowers. Private and government entities began to study in depth the effect of fire on victims. Between August 1944 and February 1945, several symposiums were held to present the results of the different studies. The most notable one was done by the company Arthur D. Littlet Incorporated, which made incendiary weapons. They used hexagonal bunkers similar to the German ones, put up an interior wall, and shot flames in from one side. In another one from Harvard University, they used similar bunkers, but with domestic pigs equipped with sensors. In some other cases, for some reason, dogs were used, which were sedated before the experiment. They might have been monsters, but at least they were decent monsters. They set up different measuring devices, and I don't want to bore you with too many scientific details, but in the end, it was discovered that Bostick's conjectures weren't so far-fetched. But at the very least, calling the flamethrower the weapon of mercy was extremely imprecise and somewhat biased. Bostick theorized that the lethality of the flamethrower went beyond just the flame itself, so there was no unnecessary suffering for the victims, since the pain is caused by the flame itself. The studies revealed impressive data. Bostick was right that there were other causes of death beyond just the flame, but these additional causes did not result in instant death. In fact, they turned out to be the most terrifying aspect of the flamethrower. Paradoxically, being hit by the flame was the best thing that could happen to you if you were targeted by a flamethrower. In enclosed places like bunkers, caves, and trenches, places where flamethrowers were usually used, a curious effect would occur when the flame was fired. The heat, being contained, would rise dramatically, like an oven, reaching temperatures between 350 and 1000 degrees inside a standard-sized bunker. That meant that even if the flame didn't hit you, depending on the design of the bunker, you could still be exposed to heat that could cause fatal injuries. This residual heat could kill you anywhere from 3 seconds to 3 minutes. So if you were exposed to this residual heat, you would end up suffering indescribable pain for up to 3 minutes. Another very interesting thing also happened, which is that the incoming flame consumed all the oxygen in the bunker. So if you happened to be too far from the flame to feel its heat, you would die agonizingly from asphyxiation. And even so, if you were far from the heat and in a well-ventilated place, like a trench, you could also die from inhaling the irritating toxic gases released by the combustion of napalm. All of this happened in a matter of minutes. Even if you were lucky enough to survive all that, you could die weeks later in agony from complications in your lungs, either from inhaling toxic gases or from heat-related injuries. Only the one who was hit directly by the flames suffered the thermal shock that caused instant death. That explained why the Marines said that when they entered the bunkers after a flamethrower blast, they often found fallen soldiers without any signs of burns. There were soldiers who fell in specific ways. But obviously, most did not suffer that merciful fate theorized by Bostick. This series of investigations was key to scientifically understanding the true barbarity of the flamethrower, finally erasing the idea that the flamethrower was a merciful weapon. Unfortunately, by the time the truth was discovered, the war was already over, and tens of thousands of soldiers had fallen victim to these cruel weapons. And if you're wondering, remember, the United States stopped using the flamethrower in the mid-1950s, using it in limited service until it disappeared completely by 1978. But not because they were cruel, but because they found a much more effective way to project flames. Napalm. But that's another story. Why did German helmets have horns in World War II? Here you'll find the answer. Thanks for watching this video and goodbye.